Give it back here. The elderly woman's voice trembled, her hands flailing helplessly. But no one stood up. No one did anything. A faint sound broke the silence. A man wearing a black hoodie slowly stood up, his figure seemingly separated from the crowd. He stepped forward, his cold gaze fixed directly on the young man. Enough! His voice was deep but sharp as a knife. The young man startled, turning around, trying to maintain a defiant demeanor. Who do you think you are? The man did not respond. He lightly adjusted his cap, revealing eyes as sharp as steel. You have just made a big mistake. The atmosphere in the train car grew heavy. Each passenger held their breath, witnessing the confrontation. The man raised his hand, pointing to the handbag under the floor. Pick it up, return it, and apologize. The young man stood stiffly. The entire train car awaited. If you want to know what happens next and how this man turns an ordinary train ride into a lesson the world must remember, continue following the story. Don't forget to like and share if this touched you. The story starts here.
The story began as an ordinary subway ride with Jason Statham, but in an instant, it became a moment that sent the entire world abuzz. You won't believe what happens next and how it changes everything. Stay tuned until the end, because this story is sure to surprise you. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support is a great motivation. And share where you're watching from in the comments below. Jason Statham sat quietly on an old plastic seat, his baseball cap pulled low over his face, a simple hoodie helping him blend into the curious gazes around him. The rumbling of the subway reverberated through the metal walls, creating a steady rhythm that soothed the weary senses of the tired passengers nearby. His eyes scanned the crowd with the calm and finesse of someone accustomed to observing. No cameras, no flashing lights, no fans rushing to get his autograph. For the first time in months, he was just an ordinary passenger. He enjoyed that invisible feeling. Inside the subway car, the air was tinged with the scent of metal, worn leather, and the faint aroma of fast food someone had left under a seat. Jason leaned back, his eyes half closed, letting the murmur of the train carry away all worries. It had been a long time since he felt this free. No directors shouting orders, no promotional tours, no flashlights capturing every moment. Every glance, every small mistake, or just a man in the crowd. But that fleeting peace didn't last long. At the next station, the train shuddered as it came to a halt, and a new group of passengers boarded. Among them was a young man wearing a gray hoodie with the hood pulled over his head. His sharp eyes darted back and forth, quickly scanning the subway car. Jason recognized him immediately. He had seen this kind of energy before, uneasy, restless, as if searching for something or someone to cause trouble. The young man's gaze fixed intently on a target. It was an elderly black woman, around 60 or 70 years old. She slowly stepped into the train, clutching a large, bulky handbag tightly to her chest. Her steps were slow and careful. Her worn shoes dragged on the floor as she tried to find a seat. No one offered her a place. Jason felt a pang of discomfort rise within him as he watched the scene unfold. The woman glanced around, hoping for help, her eyes settling on a few seated passengers. But not a single one looked up. Disappointment briefly clouded her face. Jason observed from beneath his cap, his jaw clenched. He considered standing up to offer his seat, but before he could act, the young man in the hoodie stepped forward. At first, Jason thought he intended to help the woman. But then it happened. The story began as an ordinary subway ride with Jason Statham, but in an instant, it became a moment that sent the entire world abuzz. You won't believe what happens next and how it changes everything. Stay tuned until the end, because this story is sure to surprise you. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Your support is a great motivation. And share where you're watching from in the comments below. Jason Statham sat quietly on an old plastic seat, his baseball cap pulled low over his face, a simple hoodie helping him blend into the curious gazes around him. The rumbling of the subway reverberated through the metal walls, creating a steady rhythm that soothed the weary senses of the tired passengers nearby. His eyes scanned the crowd with the calm and finesse of someone accustomed to observing. No cameras, no flashing lights, no fans rushing to get his autograph. For the first time in months, he was just an ordinary passenger. He enjoyed that invisible feeling. Inside the subway car, the air was tinged with the scent of metal, worn leather, and the faint aroma of fast food someone had left under a seat. Jason leaned back, his eyes half closed, letting the murmur of the train carry away all worries. It had been a long time since he felt this free. No directors shouting orders, no promotional tours, no flashlights capturing every moment. Every glance, every small mistake, or just a man in the crowd. But that fleeting peace didn't last long. At the next station, the train shuddered as it came to a halt, and a new group of passengers boarded. Among them was a young man wearing a gray hoodie with the hood pulled over his head. His sharp eyes darted back and forth, quickly scanning the subway car. Jason recognized him immediately. He had seen this kind of energy before, uneasy, restless, as if searching for something or someone to cause trouble. The young man's gaze fixed intently on a target. It was an elderly black woman, around 60 or 70 years old. She slowly stepped into the train, clutching a large, bulky handbag tightly to her chest. Her steps were slow and careful. Her worn shoes dragged on the floor as she tried to find a seat. No one offered her a place. Jason felt a pang of discomfort rise within him as he watched the scene unfold. The woman glanced around, hoping for help, her eyes settling on a few seated passengers. But not a single one looked up. Disappointment briefly clouded her face. Jason observed from beneath his cap, his jaw clenched. He considered standing up to offer his seat, but before he could act, the young man in the hoodie stepped forward. At first, Jason thought he intended to help the woman. But then it happened. "Move aside, old lady," the young man snapped, his voice cold and hostile. He blocked her path, forcing her to halt mid-step. The woman's eyes widened in surprise. She looked at him, confused, then bowed her head, trying to maneuver around him. But he stepped in front of her again. "I said move aside," he shouted, giving her a slight shove. The elderly woman staggered back, gripping a metal pole tightly to maintain her balance. Gasps of astonishment echoed from the surrounding passengers. Jason tightened his fist, his fingers subtly twitching, instinctively urging him to stand up, but he did nothing. He simply watched, his eyes narrowing, his heartbeat accelerating. The young man sneered, looking around the subway car as if awaiting applause. A few passengers smirked. The man sitting opposite Jason curled his lip in amusement, shaking his head as if the whole situation was a joke. Others glanced over furtively but quickly looked away, not wanting to get involved. "Look at this old lady's bag," the young man called out loudly, his tone mocking, like a comedian on stage. "Dragging this ugly house around in that bag. What's she carrying in there? Rocks?" A few people laughed, but the laughter was awkward and uneasy. Some passengers quietly pulled out their phones, beginning to record the scene. Under his hoodie, Jason clenched his hand into a fist. He could feel the powerful beat of his pulse throbbing in his ears. The elderly woman didn't respond. She only tightened her grip on the bag, trying to move past, her eyes lowering to the subway floor to avoid everyone's gaze. But the young man had no intention of stopping. He approached again, standing in front of her, his mocking smile becoming more pronounced. "Where do you think you're going?" he taunted, his voice drawn out and derisive. "Can't you hear me? I'm talking to you." He pushed harder, causing the woman to stumble into the metal pole. The bag slipped from her hands, falling to the floor with a loud thud. Jason sprang to his feet, almost instinctively, but immediately hesitated. He slowly sat back down, his gaze still fixed on the unfolding scene. His heart pounded fiercely in his chest. Someone had to step in and stop this. There were at least 20 people in this subway car, including the young man, adults, and the woman. Someone had to do something, but no one moved. The elderly woman bent down to pick up the bag, her hands trembling as she tried to lift it. The young man also bent down, snatching the bag from her hands before raising it high, as if taunting her. Her face wrinkled in shock, her eyes brimming with disbelief. "Give it back." Her voice broke, trembling as though she were on the verge of tears. "That's mine. Please, give it back." "Oh, now you've got something to say, huh?" The young man sneered, shaking the handbag in front of her like a toy. "Too late for that, old lady. You should have spoken up sooner." The elderly woman reached out, but he yanked the bag away, laughing loudly. A few passengers still held up their phones, their faces indifferent. Some chuckled softly, while others pretended not to see. One man in a suit unfolded a newspaper, hiding his face behind its pages. Jason clenched his jaw so tightly it hurt. Every part of him screamed to act, yet he stayed seated. Disgust surged within him, not for the young man, not even for the apathetic passengers. It was for himself, for waiting, for hoping someone else would do the right thing. They wouldn't. Jason stood up. This time he didn't sit back down. With slow, deliberate steps, he moved toward the young man. At first, no one noticed him. Their eyes were glued to the spectacle unfolding before them. The young man swung the bag like a prize he'd just won. The elderly woman reached out again, but he roughly shoved her back with his free hand. Jason's eyes darkened. "Enough," Jason said, his voice low but razor-sharp. The young man turned, narrowing his eyes at him. "What did you just say, old man?" He cocked his head, sizing Jason up. "Who do you think you are?" Jason pulled back the hood of his sweatshirt just enough for his face to be visible. The sneer on the young man's face faltered. "Give it back," Jason said, his tone calm but deadly. Silence fell over the subway car. The atmosphere shifted. Passengers lowered their phones, recognition dawning on their faces. "You're not serious," the young man muttered, his bravado wavering. "I don't care who you are, man. You're not special." "Last chance," Jason said, stepping closer. His eyes were cold, sharp as shattered glass. "Put it down." The young man hesitated, glancing around at the other passengers, but no one offered him support. Even the man with the smug smile turned his face away. All right," the young man said, raising his hands as if surrendering. "Relax, man. It's just a joke." He bent down and set the bag on the floor. "There, take it. Happy now?" "Geez. Apologize," Jason commanded, not moving an inch. The young man scowled. "Come on, man. I was just—" "Apologize," Jason repeated, his voice as unyielding as stone. The young man swallowed hard, his face twisting in frustration. Finally, he turned to the elderly woman. "I'm sorry," he muttered, barely audible. "Louder," Jason demanded, his tone unrelenting. "I said I'm sorry, okay?" The young man snapped, throwing his hands in the air. Jason took another step forward, his gaze locking onto him. "Now lie down." On the floor, the young man's face went pale. He hesitated, his eyes darting around for an escape. But Jason's unwavering stare left no room for negotiation. Slowly, the young man lowered himself to the ground, lying flat on his stomach, his hands behind his head. Jason stood over him, his breathing steady, his eyes never leaving the young man. The tension in the car was palpable. A woman near the back of the train whispered, "Is that Jason Statham?" This time, several passengers raised their phones. The elderly woman sat down, clutching her bag tightly, tears glistening in her eyes. She looked up at Jason, her lips quivering. "Thank you," she whispered. Jason didn't reply. He simply nodded, his focus remaining on the young man lying face down on the filthy subway floor. The subway doors slammed shut with a metallic clang. The train jolted forward, its rumble echoing through the confined metal space. Jason Statham stood firm, his gaze fixed on the man beneath him, who lay still against the cold, grimy floor. The elderly woman sat just a few steps away, clutching her handbag as though it were a lifeline. Her tearful eyes lingered on Jason, gratitude radiating silently from her expression. She said nothing, but her silence spoke volumes. The atmosphere in the subway car was utterly transformed. Those who had laughed at the young man's antics now sat in stunned silence. Some passengers lowered their phones. Others glanced nervously around, unsure where to look. Jason had shattered an unspoken agreement, the tacit understanding that everyone would mind their own business, no matter what. A sharp clatter broke the silence. At the far end of the car, a passenger accidentally dropped their phone, the noise startling everyone. Jason didn't flinch. His eyes remained locked on the young man. The young man didn't move or resist. His breathing was shallow and rapid. His head tilted just enough to see Jason out of the corner of his eye. The smirk was gone, replaced by fear. "Don't even think about it," Jason said quietly, his voice low and cutting. "I'm not moving, man," the young man stammered, his words muffled by the dirty floor beneath his face. His breaths were quick and uneven. "I swear, I'm not moving." "Good," Jason replied, his voice colder than steel. A woman, sitting nearby, shifted uncomfortably, her gaze darting between Jason, the young man, and the elderly woman. She glanced at her phone, as if debating whether to call someone, but instead shoved it into her bag and stared out the window, as though it could shield her from the tension. "Has anyone called the police?" Jason asked, his voice cutting through the thick silence as his eyes scanned the car. The passengers exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke up. Jason's tone sharpened. "I said, has anyone called the police?" A man in a suit at the end of the car cleared his throat, his fingers still tapping on his phone. Yeah, I called them," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. "They said they're on their way." Jason took another step forward, his gaze locking onto him. "Now lie down." On the floor, the young man's face went pale. He hesitated, his eyes darting around for an escape. But Jason's unwavering stare left no room for negotiation. Slowly, the young man lowered himself to the ground, lying flat on his stomach, his hands behind his head. Jason stood over him, his breathing steady, his eyes never leaving the young man. The tension in the car was palpable. A woman near the back of the train whispered, "Is that Jason Statham?" This time, several passengers raised their phones. The elderly woman sat down, clutching her bag tightly, tears glistening in her eyes. She looked up at Jason, her lips quivering. "Thank you," she whispered. Jason didn't reply. He simply nodded, his focus remaining on the young man lying face down on the filthy subway floor. The subway doors slammed shut with a metallic clang. The train jolted forward, its rumble echoing through the confined metal space. Jason Statham stood firm, his gaze fixed on the man beneath him, who lay still against the cold, grimy floor. The elderly woman sat just a few steps away, clutching her handbag as though it were a lifeline. Her tearful eyes lingered on Jason, gratitude radiating silently from her expression. She said nothing, but her silence spoke volumes. The atmosphere in the subway car was utterly transformed. Those who had laughed at the young man's antics now sat in stunned silence. Some passengers lowered their phones. Others glanced nervously around, unsure where to look. Jason had shattered an unspoken agreement, the tacit understanding that everyone would mind their own business, no matter what. A sharp clatter broke the silence. At the far end of the car, a passenger accidentally dropped their phone, the noise startling everyone. Jason didn't flinch. His eyes remained locked on the young man. The young man didn't move or resist. His breathing was shallow and rapid, his head tilted just enough to see Jason out of the corner of his eye. The smirk was gone, replaced by fear. "Don't even think about it," Jason said quietly, his voice low and cutting. "I'm not moving, man," the young man stammered, his words muffled by the dirty floor beneath his face. His breaths were quick and uneven. "I swear, I'm not moving." "Good," Jason replied, his voice colder than steel. A woman, sitting nearby, shifted uncomfortably, her gaze darting between Jason, the young man, and the elderly woman. She glanced at her phone, as if debating whether to call someone, but instead shoved it into her bag and stared out the window, as though it could shield her from the tension. "Has anyone called the police?" Jason asked, his voice cutting through the thick silence as his eyes scanned the car. The passengers exchanged uneasy glances, but no one spoke up. Jason's tone sharpened. I said, "Has anyone called the police?" A man in a suit at the end of the car cleared his throat, his fingers still tapping on his phone. Yeah, I called them," he muttered, avoiding eye contact. "They said they're on their way." The young man's breathing quickened, his fingers twitching as he weighed his options. His muscles began to tense. "Don't even think about it," Jason warned again, his voice a low growl, like a predator done playing with its prey. Another minute passed. The train doors hissed closed, and the car jolted as it began to roll toward the next station. Jason glanced back at the elderly woman. She clutched her bag tightly, her gaze fixed on him with newfound resolve. In her eyes now was a flame, a strength that hadn't been there before. She was no longer just a victim. She had become something more. The young man muttered something, his face pressed against the floor, twisted in frustration. Jason raised an eyebrow. "What was that? Speak up. This is so stupid." The young man spat, his voice laced with venom. "You act like you're a cop or something." Jason chuckled under his breath. "I don't need a badge to know right from wrong." He tilted his head, his eyes sharp as knives. "But you? Seems like you might need one." The wail of the sirens grew louder, and moments later, the flashing blue and red lights reflected through the subway car windows. The train began to slow again, the tension in the air thick enough to cut. "Beacon Station," the intercom announced. "Please stand clear of the doors." Jason's eyes never left the young man. The train jolted as it came to a stop, and passengers held their breath, clutching their seats. Seconds later, the doors hissed open. There was a heavy pause before the sound of footsteps echoed down the platform. For police officers stepped into the car, their faces set in stone, their eyes scanning the scene before landing on the young man lying on the floor. The lead officer, a tall man with close-cropped hair, took a step forward. "What's going on here?" Jason didn't flinch, nodding toward the man on the ground. "That guy tried to steal her bag," Jason said, nodding toward the elderly woman. The woman straightened her back slightly, as though regaining a bit of strength. Her eyes, still brimming with quiet gratitude, stayed fixed on Jason. He shoved her, grabbed the bag, and tried to run. "I stopped him," Jason continued, his tone steady. The police officers exchanged glances. One of them stepped forward and pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "Get up," he barked at the young man. "I didn't do anything," the man protested, but the officer grabbed his arm and hauled him to his feet. "I didn't do anything. She dropped the bag." "Tell it to the judge," the officer snapped, twisting the young man's arm behind his back and locking the cuffs around his wrists. The cold clink of metal was like the final punctuation mark on his resistance. Jason stood motionless, watching as the officers escorted the man out of the subway car. Around him, the other passengers let out quiet sighs of relief. A few murmured to each other, their expressions still tinged with unease. The elderly woman dabbed at her tears with a handkerchief, her eyes never leaving Jason. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice trembling but sincere. Jason gave a small nod, saying nothing. The message was clear enough. The train doors slid shut, and the rumbling of the wheels on the tracks resumed. Jason sat back down, his heart rate steadying, his gaze distant as though leaving it all behind. The woman gave him a faint smile before turning her eyes elsewhere. The subway moved into the tunnel, the rhythmic clatter of wheels filling the space. But the atmosphere inside the car remained heavy. Jason sat near the end of the car, staring straight ahead, though his mind lingered on what had just transpired. Across from him, the elderly woman held tightly to her bag, her gaze distant. Her fingers occasionally trembled, a subtle reminder that fear still lingered. The earlier tension had morphed into something heavier, shame. No one in the car looked directly at each other. Their eyes stayed glued to their phones or fixed on the windows, where the darkness of the tunnel raced past like an endless reel of film. Jason noticed it all. The boldness of some Passengers earlier, those who had laughed, even encouraged the young man, was now gone. Their faces were pale, their gazes downcast. The police had left with the young man in handcuffs, but the weight of what had happened still hung in the air like a ghost that refused to leave. Jason glanced at the elderly woman. She hadn't spoken since thanking him, her eyes flitting around nervously, as though bracing for another calamity. He recognized the feeling, the belief that trouble never truly ends. "You okay?" Jason asked, his voice low but strong enough to cut through the train's noise. The woman blinked, looking up as if pulled from deep thoughts. Her eyes met his, and for the first time, they no longer carried fear. "I'm fine, son," she said, offering a weak but genuine smile. Her voice was soft but resolute. "I've been through worse." She adjusted the bag on her lap, patting it lightly as though comforting a frightened child. "But thank you for what you did. Most people would have just stood by." Jason nodded, his jaw tightening as he glanced around the car at the other passengers, who still pretended not to hear. "That's the thing," he muttered. "People are always brave, until it's time to actually be brave." The woman chuckled softly, a dry, humorless laugh that didn't quite reach her eyes. "True enough," she replied, her gaze lingering on him a little longer, as if trying to place him. She tilted her head slightly, narrowing her eyes. "You look familiar. Have we met before?" Jason leaned back, pulling his cap lower over his face. "Probably just a common face," he said evenly, his eyes darting away. The woman laughed again, shaking her head. "Maybe," she said, though her tone carried a hint of doubt. Time passed in relative silence. The metallic screech of the train filled the car, occasionally interrupted by the dispassionate voice announcing the next station. A man at the far end of the car glanced at Jason, his eyes narrowing as though trying to connect the dots. Jason ignored him, his gaze fixed straight ahead. The man pulled out his phone, swiping a few times before glancing back at Jason. His eyes widened. "Oh," he muttered, his gaze flicking between Jason and his screen. Jason knew what was coming. The man's eyes locked onto him, his face lighting up with recognition. He leaned forward, his excitement almost palpable. "Hey, wait a second. Is that Jason Statham?" he said, loud enough for the rest of the passengers to hear. Heads turned. A ripple of whispers spread through the car. People leaned in, their eyes wide, hands slowly reaching for their phones. Those who had been silent moments ago were now buzzing with energy. "Is that really him?" a teenage girl whispered to her friend, pointing toward Jason, her phone half raised. "Oh my God, it is Jason Statham," another man murmured, pulling off his headphones for a better look. Jason exhaled quietly, his face hardening. He'd been in this situation countless times before. It always started the same way, with hushed whispers, then glances, then phones and photos. Once it began, it never stopped. His brief moment of anonymity evaporated in an instant. He shot a sharp look at the man who had sparked the commotion, his icy gaze enough to freeze the man mid-sentence. The man's grin faltered, his expression shifting to one of sheepish regret. Jason said nothing, but his piercing gaze conveyed everything. "Don't." But it was already too late. "Hey Jason, my man, can I grab a quick picture?" a man called out, holding his phone up as if ready to snap. Others followed suit, phones gripped tightly, camera apps open, fingers hovering over the record button. "Just one shot. Come on." Jason slowly shook his head, his cold, steely gaze slicing through the man. "Not today," he said, his tone calm but firm, brooking no argument. He didn't need to shout, and he didn't need to raise his voice. The man hesitated, then reluctantly lowered his phone, looking like a scolded child. But a teenage girl wasn't so easily deterred. She stealthily snapped a photo, the faint click of her phone camera loud enough to draw Jason's sharp eyes to her. She froze, her face flushing a deep red as she quickly lowered her phone, clearly embarrassed. The elderly woman watched the scene unfold, a faint smile tugging at her lips. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes twinkling with recognition. "I knew it," she said softly, her smile growing wider. "I knew I'd seen you somewhere before." She leaned back, nodding as though solving a puzzle that had been nagging her all day. Jason Statham, huh? Well, I'll be. Jason glanced at her, and for the first time since boarding the train, a small smile played at the corner of his lips. Keep it to yourself, he said quietly, tapping the brim of his cap. Your secret's safe with me, son, she replied with a wink. The crackling intercom interrupted the moment. Next stop, Midway Junction. Doors will open on the right. The train began to decelerate, inertia causing passengers to sway forward. A few gathered their belongings, preparing to disembark. Jason kept his gaze fixed on the floor, letting the moment pass. But he knew better. The whispers hadn't stopped, the covert glances hadn't stopped, and now the flash of cameras wouldn't stop either. Man, I'm posting this to TikTok, someone muttered from the far end of the car. Jason closed his eyes, exhaling slowly. Of course you are, he muttered under his breath. What he'd just done, standing up to protect someone who needed help, didn't matter anymore. To them, it was just a video, another piece of content to upload, to chase likes and views. The train screeched to a halt, jolting lightly as the doors hissed open. A few passengers stepped off, but not before one man lingered just long enough to snap another picture of Jason before quickly darting out of the car. Jason's jaw tightened as he gripped the edge of his seat. The elderly woman watched him for a moment, then leaned forward, her voice low but brimming with wisdom. Don't let them get to you, son, she said. They see the glitz and glamour, not the fight. Jason glanced at her, his brows furrowing slightly. She smiled, tilting her head toward him like a grandmother sharing a cherished secret. You did the right thing, she said firmly. Doesn't matter who notices or who doesn't. The train doors slid shut. Jason sat still, letting her words settle in his mind. For a fleeting moment he felt lighter. Then his phone buzzed in his pocket. Jason pulled it out and glanced at the screen. A notification from social media lit up. You're trending. Jason Statham stopped subway mugging in real life. He stared at the message, unmoving. As another alert popped up, Jason Statham proves he's a real-life action hero. Stops attacker on subway. And then another viral video. Jason Statham takes down thug on the subway. Watch now. Jason sighed, locking the screen and shoving the phone back into his pocket. He leaned back in his seat, his head resting against the cool metal of the train wall. He glanced one last time at the elderly woman. She was staring out the window, her bag secure on her lap, her hands now steady and firm. The train rattled, shaking as it delved deeper into the tunnel. Jason closed his eyes, letting the world fade away. No cameras, no flashing lights, no noise. Just the steady hum of the subway tracks beneath him. But Jason knew it was too late. Somewhere, his face was already plastered on screens. Somewhere, someone was sharing that image, and the world would know before he even reached his stop. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, casting a dim, uneven glow. Jason sat there, arms crossed, eyes closed, but his mind raced. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on him, heavier than any role he'd ever played. He knew it was only a matter of time before his phone buzzed nonstop with calls, messages, and notifications. Fame was a double-edged sword, and he'd just sharpened it again. The elderly woman sat quietly across from him, her eyes fixed on her bag. Her hands moved slowly over its fabric, tracing its seams as if grounding herself back in reality. Each small motion spoke volumes about her determination to find calm after the storm. She looked at Jason again, her gaze void of curiosity or admiration. It was something deeper, perhaps respect or gratitude. At the far end of the car, two teenagers whispered to each other, glancing at their phone screens. One of them stifled a laugh, tilting his phone toward his friend. Jason didn't need to guess. He knew exactly what was on that screen, his face, his name, that video. His phone vibrated again, once, twice, and then a third time. Jason slowly pulled it out, dreading what he'd see. As expected, a flood of messages greeted him. From his manager, from his PR team, and from 3 people he hadn't spoken to in weeks. Jason stared at the screen for a moment before locking it again and slipping it back into his pocket. He leaned against the seat, letting out a heavy sigh. The train rattled on, its fluorescent lights flickering like distant stars, as Jason braced himself for what was to come. "Jason, call me immediately. You're blowing up online. We need to handle this now. Dude, you're a legend for this. Everyone's talking about you non-stop." Jason powered off his phone and shoved it into his pocket. He wasn't ready to deal with it. Not yet. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and let out a long breath through his nose. The weight pressing on his shoulders hadn't lightened. If anything, it felt heavier. The static-laced voice of the subway intercom broke through his thoughts. "Next stop, Sycamore. Doors will open on the right." A woman in the middle of the car stood, adjusted her coat, and picked up her bag. Her eyes lingered on Jason just a moment too long before she turned toward the door. She didn't say anything, but she knew. They all knew. Recognition was like a chain reaction. One person points, then another, and soon enough the entire world knows. "Is that him?" one of the two teenagers whispered, holding his phone low while keeping his eyes on Jason. "I swear that's him, bro. That's Statham." The friend glanced over, his eyes widening. "No way," he whispered, already reaching for his phone. Jason caught the movement in his peripheral vision. His patience was wearing thin, but he remained composed. Leaning back in his seat, he pulled his cap lower, shielding more of his face. Not that it ever truly helped. The subway screeched as it slowed, metal grinding against metal as it pulled into Sycamore Station. The doors hissed open, ushering in a cold draft that swept through the car. A few passengers stepped off, their glances darting toward Jason as they passed. A man in a gray hoodie paused at the doorway, his eyes fixed on Jason, as though piecing together a puzzle in his mind. Jason felt the stare, sharp and invasive, like a needle pressing into his side. "It's him," the man muttered, pulling out his phone. Jason's jaw tightened. Nearby, the elderly woman noticed. She leaned forward slightly, her sharp, knowing eyes locking on the man at the door. She didn't say a word, but her expression spoke volumes. The man hesitated. He looked at her, then back at Jason. Finally, as though under some invisible pressure, he reluctantly lowered his phone and slipped it back into his pocket. He stepped off the train just as the doors slid shut behind him. Jason glanced at the elderly woman. She gave him a small nod, which he returned in kind. The train jolted forward, resuming its journey with a rumble that shook the entire car. Passengers gripped the handrails, bracing against the motion. The ride continued in a tense silence. No more laughter, no one recording. But Jason knew this calm wouldn't last. Minutes passed. His phone buzzed again. This time he didn't check it. He already knew. In his mind, he could hear the headlines. Jason Statham stops subway mugging. Statham becomes real-life action hero. The media loved stories like these. They'd blow it out of proportion, turning him into something larger than life, something he wasn't. He wasn't a hero. He'd simply done what anyone should do. But he knew none of that mattered. Across from him, the elderly woman cleared her throat softly. "They're going to turn you into a story, sweetheart," she said, her voice calm but firm. Jason looked at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Yeah," he muttered. "They will. Don't let them write the ending," she added, her gaze steady and unwavering. "It's still your story." Her words struck a chord, deeper than Jason expected. He leaned back in his seat, eyes fixed on the ceiling as her advice sank in. "Your story, your ending." The train rattled on, each passing minute feeling heavier than the last. The teenagers continued to whisper, still sneaking glances at him, but they didn't approach. Jason didn't need to look. He knew what they were doing, taking pictures, sending them to friends, posting online. By the time he stepped off this train, half the world would know. He glanced at the elderly woman again. She had closed her eyes, her head resting back slightly, her breathing steady and calm. She was finally resting, after everything. Jason watched her for a moment, a quiet sense of peace settling in his chest. His phone buzzed once more, and his patience snapped. He yanked it out, ready to turn it off completely. But then he saw the message at the top of the screen. It wasn't from his manager, his PR rep, or some meaningless news alert. It was from his sister. "Proud of you, Jay. You did the right thing." Jason stared at the words. That was it. Simple, clear, honest. His chest tightened. Not with frustration or anger, but something softer, something deeper. He slid the phone back into his pocket and leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. For the first time since everything started, he allowed himself to breathe. The intercom crackled again. "Next stop, Southgate. Doors will open on the right." Jason straightened up slightly. This was his stop. He glanced at the elderly woman. Her eyes were still closed, her breathing steady. He didn't want to disturb her. She'd been through enough. As the train slowed, Jason stood, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. The woman stirred slightly, one eye opening. She smiled at him, slow and gentle, as if she knew something he didn't. "Take care, sweetheart," she said softly. "You too," Jason replied, his voice low but firm. "Stay safe." The train came to a complete stop. The doors slid open, ushering in a cool gust of air that swept through the car. Jason stepped toward the exit, his eyes scanning the platform. No cameras, no crowds. Just ordinary people wrapped up in their own lives, oblivious to him. He stepped out decisively, his head low, his stride steady and deliberate. Behind him, the doors slid shut with a soft hiss. He didn't look back, there was no need. As he walked along the platform, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Once, then again, and then again. Messages from his manager, from his PR team, from news outlets, and from people he hadn't spoken to in years, each of them wanting a piece of his story. His story. Jason kept moving, head still lowered, his steps unbroken. The world could watch if it wanted to. Let them. Because for the first time in a long time, Jason wasn't playing a role. This time, he was just a man doing the right thing. The city skyline glowed in the warm hues of a setting sun. Golden rays stretched across the streets below, mingling with the symphony of honking horns and bustling urban life. Jason stood by the window of his apartment, one hand resting on the sill, the other holding his phone. He had been there for 20 minutes, staring at the screen as messages flooded in. Notifications piled up like a cascading tower of dominoes. Texts, missed calls, and countless mentions on social media. His face betrayed no emotion, but his fingers drummed the edge of the phone, slow and deliberate. "Jason, the video has 2 million views already. Call me immediately. We need to manage this. Jason, the media is eating this up. You're a hero. People love you for this." Statham stops NYC subway attacker. Hollywood star becomes viral anti-racism hero. Jason ran a hand down his face and exhaled heavily, the sound long and weary. They hadn't even gotten the story right. They never did. This wasn't about him. It shouldn't have been about him. It should have been about that woman, about how no one stepped in to help her until it was almost too late. But that wasn't the story people wanted to hear. No, they wanted a hero. They wanted Jason Statham, the action star, leaping into action just like in his movies. He tossed the phone onto the table and sank into the couch, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. The weight of it all felt like a lead blanket pressing down on him. He hadn't asked for this. He didn't want it. All he wanted that day was to be invisible, to be just another man on the subway. But now the entire world was watching. A sharp knock echoed through the apartment, loud and deliberate. Jason turned his head slowly, his narrowed eyes fixed on the door. The knock came again, quicker this time, more urgent. "Jason, it's me, Kevin Reed." A familiar voice called out from the other side of the door. "Open up, man. I know you're in there." Jason hesitated for a moment, then stood and walked to the door. He unlocked it and pulled it open, revealing the familiar face of Kevin Reed, his longtime friend and occasional bodyguard. Logan stepped inside quickly, his eyes darting around the room as if checking for potential threats. In his hand was his phone, and his face was lined with tension. "You're everywhere right now," Logan said, shaking his head as his eyes swept the apartment. "Everywhere, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, you name it. You're blowing up, man." "I know," Jason muttered, returning to the couch. He sank back into his seat and rubbed his temples. "I don't need to check. My phone won't stop buzzing." Logan sat down next to him, his eyes still glued to his phone. He glanced at Jason, his expression growing more serious. "They're calling you a hero, Jay. People love you for this. They're saying you stepped up when no one else did. Do you know how rare that is?" Jason grabbed his phone from the table, unlocked it, and opened the camera app. He sat down on the edge of the sofa, holding the phone up so his face filled the frame. No lights, no fancy angles. Just him, raw and unfiltered. Logan leaned back in his chair, folding his arms across his chest with a faint smile. "All right," Jason muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. He took a deep breath, then hit record. Jason stared directly into the camera, his face calm but resolute. His sharp eyes and clenched jaw projected unwavering focus. He didn't blink, didn't flinch. His voice cut through the silence, deep and steady. "By now, you've probably seen the video," he began, his tone sharp as a blade. "And I know what they're saying. They're calling me a hero, saying I did something extraordinary. But I'm here to tell you, that's not the story." He paused, letting his words sink in. His gaze remained locked on the camera. "This story isn't about me. It's about the woman on that train. An elderly woman just living her life, harassed, shoved, disrespected. And do you know what hurt the most? It wasn't the guy who did it. It was the fact that no one did anything about it." Jason leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "They watched. They laughed. They filmed it like it was some kind of entertainment." His voice dropped, carrying a weight that filled the room. "That's the real story. That's the part no one wants to talk about. People saw something wrong, and they turned away. They pulled out their phones instead of their courage." Jason leaned even closer to the camera, his tone cold, almost cutting. "If you're watching this video, I want you to ask yourself one question. What would you do? Would you help? Or would you stand by and watch?" He leaned back slightly but kept his eyes locked on the camera. "Don't call me a hero. I'm just a guy who did what needed to be done. But next time, it might be you on that train. It might be you holding the phone. Ask yourself, will you watch or will you act?" He let the silence linger for a few seconds, his gaze piercing through the lens. Finally, he gave a small, firm nod and stopped recording. Kevin Reed looked at him, his voice low and filled with respect. "That's it. That's exactly what we needed." Jason didn't respond. He uploaded the video, no hashtags, no captions, just the bare truth. Less than a minute later, his phone buzzed. Comments, shares, messages poured in. This is what we needed to hear. Finally, someone brave enough to call it out. "He's right. I feel ashamed of myself now." Jason flipped his phone face down on the table and leaned back in his seat. His eyes were distant but resolute. He glanced at Kevin Reed, then turned toward the window, where the city lights flickered like distant stars. "Sometimes," he murmured, his eyes fixed on the glowing skyline, "you've got to write your own ending." The next morning, Jason woke to the sound of his phone vibrating incessantly on the small bedside table. It was relentless, like an alarm clock refusing to be ignored. Sunlight crept through the gaps in the curtains, casting golden streaks across the room. Jason rubbed his eyes and sat up, still groggy from a restless night. The phone continued to buzz. Call after call, notification after notification. He already knew what awaited him before he even looked. Slowly, he reached for the phone, blinking against the brightness of the screen. 70 missed calls. Over 40 messages. His inbox was flooded. Every social media app showed countless notifications, stacked like a precarious tower of bricks about to collapse. His face was everywhere, his name in every headline. Jason scrolled through the messages, each one appearing faster than he could read. "You're a legend for that. Video, Jason. Bro, you really did that. respect. The world needs more people like you. Can you join our show next week? We'd love to hear about your experience. Headlines were everywhere. His face, his words, splashed across every news segment, every social media timeline, every video platform. Clips of his message were edited and captioned for dramatic effect. Don't call me a hero. This story isn't about me. What would you do? Jason set his phone down, his gaze drifting toward the sliver of light peeking through the curtains. He shook his head, letting the phone drop onto the bed beside him. They weren't even listening. The story had grown beyond him, beyond the woman on that train. It had become a movement. People were sharing their own experiences in the comments. Some writing about times they had stayed silent when they should have spoken up, others recounting moments when they had intervened and done the right thing. The hashtag don't watch was trending. It wasn't just a hashtag. It had become a call to action. Jason leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, hands clasped together. He sat in silence, his mind replaying everything that had happened over the past 24 hours. The subway, the elderly woman, the young man face down on the floor. The weight of it all bore down heavier now. It wasn't just a single moment anymore. It had become something far bigger. His phone buzzed again. This time it was a video call from his sister. Jason sighed but answered, holding the phone up to his face. His sister, Tasha Statham, appeared on the screen, her grin wide and infectious. "Look at you, big brother, out there saving the world," she teased, leaning closer to the camera with an exaggerated smile. "You know you've broken the internet, right?" Jason rolled his eyes, leaning back against the headboard. "Don't start, Tasha. That's not what this is." "Oh, really?" she replied, tilting her head with a mock-curious expression. "You stood up for that woman, people saw it, and they were moved. There's nothing wrong with that." "I didn't do it to inspire anyone," Jason muttered, running a hand over his face. "I did it because no one else would." Tasha's expression softened. She nodded slowly. "I know, but that's exactly why it hit people so hard, Jay. You didn't have to, but you did. People see that and it makes them think. It makes them ask themselves if they'd have done the same." Jason didn't reply. He knew she was right. The problem was he had never wanted this. He just wanted to stay in the shadows, to remain invisible. But shadows don't exist when the whole world shines a spotlight on you. "Anyway," Tasha continued, her lips curling into a mischievous smile, "I called to tell you Mom saw everything. She called me, all choked up, saying how proud she is of you." She leaned closer to the camera, her grin widening. She said, "Tell Jason he's finally done something worth talking about." Jason let out a soft laugh, shaking his head. "Classic Mom. But seriously," Tasha said, her tone turning more serious, her eyes filled with concern. "Are you okay? I mean it, Jay. Are you really okay?" Jason paused, considering her question. His eyes flicked to the phone on the bed, its screen lighting up with a constant stream of messages and notifications. The world was knocking at his door, but this time he didn't feel like running. "Yeah," he said quietly, nodding. "I'm okay." "Good," Tasha replied, her smile returning. "Hang in there, big brother. I'll call you later." "All right," Jason said, ending the call. He stared at the phone for a moment longer before standing and heading to the kitchen. He poured himself a glass of water, letting the cool liquid steady his thoughts as he leaned against the counter. His mind drifted back to the elderly woman on the train, her face, her eyes, the way they shifted from fear to gratitude. His phone buzzed again. This time, it was a notification from a news outlet. "New developments in subway incident. Police issue statement." Jason raised an eyebrow, tapping the notification to open the article. The headline read, "Suspect in subway incident faces multiple charges, including assault and theft." He scrolled down. The article explained that after reviewing security footage from the subway, police had decided to press charges against the young man. Witness statements and video evidence corroborated everything Jason had described. Now, it wasn't just his word anymore. The system had seen it for itself. Toward the end of the article, there was a quote from the elderly woman. Her name was listed as Eleanor Shaw, 71, a retired nurse. Her words struck Jason harder than any headline could. I was so scared. I didn't think anyone would help me. But then he did. He didn't do it for fame or attention. He did it because it was the right thing to do. People need to remember that sometimes. You just have to do the right thing. Jason stared at the screen for a long time. He felt something shift inside him. Jason felt something solid and unshakable take root within him. He turned his phone face down on the kitchen counter and stared at his reflection in the window. His face looked tired but resolute. He walked back to the living room, sat on the sofa, and picked up his phone again. No professional cameras, no scripts, no interviews. Just him. Jason opened the camera app and pressed record. This time, there was no lengthy speech, no dramatic pauses. Only the truth. His face filled the frame, calm but determined. By now, most of you have probably seen the video, he began, his gaze unwavering. And you've likely read the headlines. They're calling me a hero again. But I'm not a hero. I'm just someone who saw something wrong and did what needed to be done. That's it. Jason leaned forward slightly, his sharp eyes seemingly cutting through the screen, speaking directly to every person watching. But this isn't about me. It was never about me. This is about her. Her name is Eleanor Shaw. She's 71 years old, a retired nurse. She's someone's mother, someone's grandmother. She didn't deserve what happened to her. Not one bit. His voice grew stronger, his jaw tightening with purpose. This isn't about being a hero. This is about you, about what you'll do when you see something wrong. Will you sit there and watch it happen, or will you stand up? Will you do something? He let the question hang in the air for a few seconds, then finished with one final statement, his voice firm. The next time you see something like this, don't just watch, act. He ended the recording and uploaded the video. No caption, no hashtags, just the plain, unvarnished truth. Within minutes, the video had spread everywhere. Comments flooded in, people shared it alongside their own stories. Parents posted it for their kids to see, schools played it in assemblies. The hashtag Don't Watch Do became a global trend in under an hour. Jason leaned back on the sofa, closing his eyes, his mind finally at ease. His phone vibrated continuously, but this time he didn't care. This time he had told the story the way it needed to be told, not about him but about her. Jason rested his head against the back of the sofa, the distant hum of the city filtering through the window. The world would always be noisy, always watching, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel the need to run from it. This time he had rewritten the ending. The story was his, but it belonged to everyone else too. And this was the conclusion of an unforgettable story. But it didn't stop here. This story is a reminder that sometimes doing the right thing can change everything. If the story moved you, let us know by liking and commenting. Thank you for supporting the channel. Like, share, and subscribe for more inspiring updates. The stories we share are collected from various sources and do not represent any specific individual or organization. They are shared to promote the universal values of humanity and have been rewritten with the assistance of AI. If there are any errors, please accept them with understanding. Wishing you all the best in life.